Now, Supreme Court justices and federal judges are now required to disclose more of the free perks that they get. That change quietly went into effect just a few days ago in the wake of increasing concerns over trips and meals and gifts accepted by justices on the nation's highest court. Gabe Roth is executive director of Fix the Court. That's an advocacy group that works to reform the U.S. federal court system. That group, of course, has for years pushed for more transparency on this issue. Thanks so much for being here. We certainly appreciate it. I saw this article in the Post and said, that sounds interesting to me. I know it seems a little, in the weeds a little bit, but there are growing concerns about judicial ethics in our country, rightfully so. We want to make sure judges are making decisions based on the law and not favor. So exactly how did this isn't a drastic overhaul, but it's a slight but still important tweak. In a nutshell, explain what's happened here.
Sure. So if you're a federal judge or a Supreme Court justice, you are required under a law passed after Watergate to file each year an annual financial disclosure report that lists any outside income, any board appointments, any investments that you or your spouse might have. And you're also supposed to list all the free trips that you take. But there's been an exemption, an exception to that rule that says if you are taken on a trip by a friend, then you can just keep. It doesn't matter if the friend is a board member of a major corporation and is inviting you on behalf of that corporation. So long as you are getting an invitation from a human being, you are allowed to exempt reporting of that free perk from your disclosure. Now, no more. So if you are getting a free perk from that friend and they're taking you to a commercial resort, you have to report it. If they're taking you on a private jet, you have to report it. So it's not, like you said, a huge change, but again, little by little, we're trying to get the judiciary kicking and screaming into the 21st century when it comes to oversight and accountability.
To that exact point, Congress has been pushing for this for years. Why does it take so long? It just seems so obvious that you want all judges, let alone at the federal level, let alone the Supremes, to have extremely tight ethics rules considering the power that they have in their courtrooms. Why is this such a fight? Why did it take so long?
I think for several reasons. The main reason being that the judges and justices see themselves or want to see themselves as an independent branch, not an interdependent branch. They believe that they're able to police themselves and set their own rules of the road when it comes to judicial ethics and accountability. And the fact is, we're all human. Everyone needs some level of oversight and enforcement, not because everyone is corrupt, but that's just the way of doing things in a modern society with a democracy that has public officials. There should be some level of accountability no matter who you are. And yes, if you're the Supreme Court, under the Constitution, it is very hard to impeach and remove, and there are good reasons for that. But by the same token, you should have basic ethics rules that, and if the justices and lower court judges aren't going to enforce them upon themselves, then Congress has every right to require them to, like they did after Watergate, make them file annual financial disclosures or make them disclose certain things about their travel gifts and perks. And to me, it's a real shame that in this day and age, when the judges and justices have become the most powerful, least accountable part of our federal government, that they're not themselves pushing for greater oversight. And so, thankfully, Congress is moving in that direction. But again, Congress is quite slow and partisan and political. So everything in Congress is always a fight, even if it's something that 80% of the American people support.
That's the truth for sure. And it strikes me as a twofold benefit. One, we should know more about judges because people who are cynical always think politicians are bought and paid for by some industry, by some powerful rich friend, okay, and by extension judges who get appointed by politicians or presidents or what have you, it fall under that category if you're cynical about our government, and a lot of folks are these days. So one, it's just the right to know, so there's some sunshine in your life as a public person with power. But then two, I assume that if something comes to light that's interesting, like your buddies with that winner, this industry paid for you to take this trip or what have you. It makes it easier for folks who dig into that to then request a certain judge recuse him or herself from a case if there's a potential conflict that's been documented, because now you have to report more of what you're doing and where you're getting your perks.
Exactly. That's sort of the next step, is that level of accountability. So we're still lacking in that level at the Supreme Court. But in the lower courts, if we find out, now that this rule is in effect, that you have flown on a private jet of, I don't know, the CEO of Amazon, and Amazon has a big case before you, a lower court judge, not the Supreme Court, one of the lower courts, and there are about 2,500 lower court federal judges in the country. If we find that out, then we can file a complaint with a judicial council, and they will investigate that complaint, and then you could get censured or reprimanded or kicked off certain cases or mandated ethics training. There are all sorts of punishments that are possible if you're a lower court judge. The problem that we have right now is that those sorts of punishment, that sort of recourse, does not currently exist at the Supreme Court. So the 1A of this new rule is that, yes, it is positive, it is a good step, it is a small step, but it is a good step. But by the same token, we definitely need to look at ways to bring in greater accountability. So if we find out that a judge or justice fails to follow these strictures, there is something that can be done, likely short of impeachment, because you're not going to impeach and remove a judge or justice over one private jet flight. Something short of impeachment that sort of hammers home to the judges and justices, specifically the justices, that this behavior is not acceptable in a modern democracy.
And to that point, that is staggering to me that it can apply to 2,500 federal judges elsewhere, but when it comes to the most powerful 9 judges in America, no rule there. What is the logic of that? They're not above the law either because they wear a black robe.
There's very little logic. It's basically it's sort of rooted in the fact that King George III was firing colonial judges in the mid-18th century. So that's why there is this life tenure in the federal judiciary, and that's why there is the Supreme Court that sits above everyone else, created by the Constitution and unfireable by the president, or I don't know, had King George or his progenitor won the War of 1812, the future king of England, had we lost that war. But yeah, I mean, it's really rooted in the Constitution, and the Constitution is rooted in what happened to be going on in the middle of the 18th century. And rules change, realities change, and power structures change. When the Supreme Court started out, it didn't have the ability to review federal laws. Now it does. Even 25 years ago, if you would have said that the Supreme Court was going to potentially pick the winners in successive presidential, well, starting in 2000, and then you could argue 04, 16, and 20, pick essentially the president, you would have been laughed out of the room. So with that increased amount of power, I think comes increased responsibility. And what we understood to be the case of terms of branch independence in 1787 or 1789, I think no longer applies. And Congress has every right under the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution to require certain enforcement mechanisms, and we're sort of getting there. There's been some bills this year in Congress that talks about enforcement of some of the ethics rules, but we're not there yet, and we really need a sustained effort from both parties in Congress to really put pressure on the justices and to pass laws to bring our judiciary into the 21st century and to make them more the crown jewel and not this sort of ethical black box that they've been for the last few decades.
Ethical black box. Interesting way to phrase that. Well, it should be interesting what gets reported if they find a way around it. And also, I'm glad we're dealing with private jets and meals and trips and vacation homes and all of that. But there's also the ethical issue that we don't have time to get into today of a more serious nature. And that, of course, is the one that came to light related to Justice Thomas and his wife's work to challenge the results of 2020 and his ability to still rule on those cases, despite now we know everything that Virginia Thomas was doing at the time. That's a whole separate issue. I would argue a more serious one, but we'll come back and discuss that another time because there hasn't been much traction on that front either. Gabe Roth, Executive Director of Fix the Court, thank you so much. Always enjoy our conversations and your expertise about I know a tedious but important issue. Thank you so much, sir.